The Objective News Network, Part 2. The Baby Formula Shortage. Are we our own worst enemy? This is John Hnatio reporting for the Objective News Network. Welcome to Part 2 of the Baby Formula Shortage. Are we our own worst enemy? Today, we will take a brief look at the government's response as to why the crisis happened and how the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, plans to prevent the problem in the future. It has now been over 6 months since critical shortages of baby formula were first widely reported in the United States. And yet, the problem still persists. Using authentication, we still find many credible data sets that indicate problems with the supply of baby formula still persist. According to this current data set at the New York Times, dated September 12, 2022, entitled, "Store Shelves Are No Longer Bare, but Baby Formula Remains in Short Supply," we are told that, and I quote, "While the situation has improved since mid-July, many families are still scrambling to find popular brands that remain out of stock. More than 6 months after one of the largest infant formula manufacturing plants in the United States issued a recall and was then shut down because of contamination concerns, a newborn staple still remains in short supply." Close quote. Going back to authentication, let's type in, why has the FDA taken so long to fix the problem of the baby formula shortage? Here we come up with an interesting data set at the Associated Press telling us, and I quote, "The Food and Drug Administration acknowledged Tuesday that its response to the U.S. infant formula shortage was slow by delays in processing a whistleblower complaint and testing samples from the nation's largest formula factory." Close quote. The story goes on. A 10-page report from the agency offers its first formal account of the factors that led to the ongoing shortage, which has forced the U.S. to airlift millions of pounds of powdered formula from overseas. The review zeroed in on several key problems at the agency, including outdated data sharing systems, inadequate staffing and training among its food inspectors, and poor visibility into formula supply chains and manufacturing procedures. Close quote. Over the past 3 decades, the General Accounting Office, or GAO, the Congressional Watchdog Agency, has issued hundreds of reports on weaknesses in America's food safety system, accompanied by congressional hearing after hearing after hearing, and yet problems that are decades old still persist. Many of the problems involving the baby formula shortage, as we noted in Part 1 of our May 31st, 2022 report, are due to systemic problems that have plagued both the FDA and the Department of Agriculture for decades, as both organizations have failed time and again to meet their food safety and security mission responsibilities. Authentication shows us that over the years, Congress has held hundreds of hearings on the issue of enhanced food safety and security with far less than mixed results. This is very significant because it raises serious questions about the effectiveness of current executive branch and congressional oversight mechanisms as they relate to the Food and Drug Administration. Oversight mechanisms that persistently and consistently fail to make certain that these systemic problems are identified in a timely way and corrected for the long term. Of course, the result of allowing weaknesses to linger only to be found at the time of the next crisis is a loss of confidence of the American people in the FDA as one of the key governmental institutions responsible for food safety and security. Just last month, the FDA issued a report identifying 15 findings that resulted in the baby formula crisis. The report identifies outdated technology and poor coordination, improper handling of whistleblower complaints, delays by transport companies in delivering samples of baby formula for testing, no effective procedures for responses to food safety incidents, that it was COVID-19 that prevented on-site responses to whistleblower and other food safety complaints at Abbott Nutrition Systems, no effective way to engage and coordinate responses with regulatory and public health officials, little, if any, training of inspectors about baby formula manufacture, a lack of funding, compliance actions that do not consider critical supply and demand issues, dated technology and record keeping by baby formula manufacturers, no food safety culture in Abbott Nutrition Systems, that Chronobacter is not a nationally reportable disease and not well enough considered in formula compliance standards, and finally, that consumers are to blame because they are poorly educated in the safe handling and preparation of baby formula. When asked about their own internal report, the Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, Dr. Robert M. Califf, had this to say: "For things that are critical to the public health, if you don't have some understanding of how all the pieces fit together, then when you get into a crisis or a shortage, you have a real problem." Dr. Califf told the Associated Press in an interview, "To a large extent, that's what happened here," said Dr. Califf. Next, let's type in, has the FDA done enough to stop future baby formula shortage? Here's a very interesting data set at Politico entitled FDA Baby Formula Review Spares Specific Blame Amid Ongoing Shortages, written by Meredith Lee. And I quote from the article: "A long-anticipated internal review of the FDA's response to the infant formula crisis stopped short of blaming any individual or federal team after the agency's head acknowledged to lawmakers earlier this year a string of failures and delays during the months-long federal response. Some parents and advocates had been looking forward to the review to shed specific light on the FDA failures in order to provide accountability. But Commissioner Califf said in an interview shortly after the report was released that the review was meant to identify themes of issues FDA needs to improve going forward," close quote. The article quotes Dr. Califf saying, "We're not going to spend a lot of time going back. We're going to spend our time taking into account what happened and then moving forward," close quote. Dr. Califf was also quoted as saying that accountability around the crisis is handled through the personnel process. Okay, let's type into authentication the question: is the Federal Employee Performance Evaluation System in the government effective? Here, authentication brings up a report from the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, that asks the question: how can a personnel performance system that gives everyone high ratings be effective? And I quote from the GAO: "A system where everyone is above average. Most federal employees receive ratings in the top performance categories. We found that more than 85% of federal executives received top ratings for fiscal years 2010 through 2013 with some federal departments giving even more of their executives top ratings, close quote. This, of course, raises the significant question as to whether federal performance appraisals really hold government employees accountable for the mission failures of their own agencies. And here's another interesting data set at Gallup.com entitled More Harm Than Good: The Truth About Performance Reviews, written by Bob Sutton and Ben Weigert. Here, we are told by experts in their field that performance reviews in most organizations are so bad that they do more harm than good. And when employees are rewarded for putting themselves ahead of colleagues and customers, it fuels greed and dysfunctional competition. Next, let's type into authentication. Is accountability in government important? Here we find another interesting data set at TechTarget's whatis.com describing the idea of accountability. And I quote, accountability is an assurance that an individual or an organization will be evaluated on their performance or behavior related to something for which they are responsible. The article goes on to tell us that the term accountability, while related to the idea of responsibility, should be considered more from the perspective of oversight. We are told that accountability means that people and organizations should be held responsible for successfully completing a task or a mission. If they fail, they must explain exactly how the problem was allowed to exist in the first place and then allowed to go unnoticed until a crisis occurred. In this sense, accountability brings to the forefront more than just who's responsible, but also the systemic failures that allowed the problem to exist in the first place, and thoroughly explaining how they will be fixed to prevent the same thing from happening over and over again. Okay, here's another interesting data set at pogo.org entitled Accountability: The Path to Improve Government Effectiveness and the Antidote to Authoritarianism by Danielle Bryan and Zoe Ryder. Here we are told, and I quote, the increasing loss of public trust in government institutions is of urgent concern. Efforts to diffuse public cynicism about these institutions have met with little success. But there is a solution. Rather than trying to persuade the public that they should trust government, we should create a government worthy of the public's trust. A fundamental first step in this direction is strengthening the accountability measures, the checks and balances that curb abuses of power and ensure our institutions are responsive to the people. The solution to this existential challenge, the loss of public trust in our institutions of government, is to reform our government institutions so that they are held accountable and are genuinely responsive and effective for the common good, not simply for the powerful few, close quote. After all, the FDA's role in violating the policy of government laissez-faire by limiting the production of baby formula to a selected powerful few producers of only 3 principal suppliers of baby formula, and FDA's policy of preventing foreign suppliers of baby formula into the U.S. market did not happen by accident. It was a considered and intentional action. Neither would it appear that the President and the Congress are doing their jobs of effective oversight to make certain that the FDA acts in the best enduring interests of American parents and their children. But in this short report, we have only considered a very small number of the important issues relating to the safety and security of America's food supply, to include the need to better protect American mothers and their babies. The most important thing here, however, is what you think. Do you believe that the FDA is being totally honest in the claim that they are now going to really fix the systemic problems that have gone uncorrected for decades by the same agency and personnel that failed to meet its mission responsibilities in the first place? Or are they acting more like Hefty the hump hamster in our picture here? Will the executive branch and Congress really live up to their responsibility to find enduring solutions to fix the problem in the long term? That's where you, as a citizen of the American Republic, come into the picture. Do you think that Commissioner Califf is right when he says it's best not to look back and simply move forward? What do you think the President and the FDA Commissioner need to do to correct problems that have been allowed to persist for so many decades, both before and now during their time on watch? We look forward to learning your ideas on the best way to prevent another baby food formula crisis and to fix, over the long term, the recurring food safety problems at FDA in their mission to properly oversee the private sector food companies we rely on. That's the way it is for October 10th, 2020. This is John Hnatio reporting for the Objective News Network. We look forward to hearing from you and your comments and ideas on what the President, FDA, and the Congress must do to prevent the next baby formula shortage at our ONN blog. See you the next time.